All right, we actually have a lot to talk about. It's about my latest book, How Can I Help? Saving Nature with Your Yard. And you had a little foreshadowing here. Humans tend to think that the earth is ours, we own it, we can do whatever we want with it. But the reality is we're evolutionary guests on this planet, and our stay here is provisional. It's going to be a very short stay if we destroy our life support systems, and we seem bent on doing that in an awful lot of places. Who's going to protect our planet? My message for the last 20 years has been everybody. It's everybody's responsibility because everybody's totally dependent on healthy ecosystems. And fortunately, more and more people are accepting this responsibility, but they do have lots of questions. They tend to send some of them to me every day. And after a while, I say, I'm getting the same questions over and over again. I should save the answers and we'll make a book out of it. And that's what How Can I Help is. It is 499 questions that people have asked me over the years. And the first question I get is, why didn't you make it 500 questions? It actually was a lot more than that. But when we sent it to Timber Press, they said, this is way too long. And they started throwing questions at it, and it turned out to be 499. Now, don't worry, I'm only going to talk about 498 today. So let's get started. One of the first ones that I get repeatedly is what got me interested in conservation. And there actually is a real story there. When I was in third grade, we moved into a new house in a new development in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey called Oak Park. They called it Oak Park because oaks are what they cut down to make the development. And our house was the first house to be built on a circle, and then they built them from right to left around. So the lot to the left of us was undeveloped for a full year after we moved in. And there was a little pond on that lot. And I used to go there every day after school and see what was happening. And in the spring, this is what was happening. Toads came and started to sing, and I thought that was really cool. I don't remember whether I knew they were males or not, but then bigger toads came, and the singers hugged them. And I thought that was very nice. They kept hugging them until the eggs came. And of course, this is external fertilization. The male is hanging on the female, and as she lays her eggs, he fertilizes those eggs. And then the eggs hatch, and I got to see the whole metamorphosis of these little American toads. First, the pollywogs come out, or the tadpoles, whatever you want to call them. Then the hind legs pop out, and then the front legs pop out. Then the tail starts to get shorter, and it gets a lot shorter until just before they hatch out or they walk out onto the land. They are really tiny, but they're ready to start their terrestrial life. I wanted to be there the day that those toads walked out onto the land, and I was there. That's not really me. But that was the day that the bulldozer came and buried the whole pond. He would have buried me too. I don't think he saw me there, but I ran away. So it made an impression on me, and it was the same impression that was being made on a lot of people around the world. We have to save nature before people destroy it. The problem with that is, and of course that makes sense, but the problem is very few of us have the opportunity to save pristine habitat. We all have the opportunity to start to restore habitat. And the main message here, and I think back on it with a little bit of regret, but we have to move beyond conservation. We still want to conserve things, but we have to move beyond conservation and embrace restoration. It is time to rebuild the world. I could have walked right across to my backyard and dug another pond. My parents would have helped me, but it never occurred to me. Never occurred to me. Lost opportunity. Okay, another question I get is, why can't insects adapt quickly to non-native plants? Now, that's been another one of my messages. Most of our insects are specialists. They can only eat particular native plants, and we bring in an awful lot of non-native plants. Why is that a problem? We all know that insects can adapt to insecticides pretty quickly. Well, this is how that happens. In a population of insects, there's already a few that have some level of resistance. So when you spray a field, they don't die. Then the next generation, there's more of them, and the next generation, there's more of them because they're the only ones that survive, and then pretty soon everybody's resistant. It happens in really just a relatively few number of generations. The important thing here is that no new traits had to evolve for the resistance to happen. It simply spreads in the population. That's very different from what has to happen when an insect adopts a new host plant. There's all kinds of very new adaptations that have to come about. The first thing that's happening, let's pretend we're this red-spotted purple butterfly here. We're flying around, and there's this matrix of plants beneath us, hundreds of species of plants. We have to decide which one is an appropriate host plant. And we do that by smelling the plant with sensors in our antennae. So for us to adopt a new host plant, there have to be mutations in the antennae that tell us there is a new host plant down there that's acceptable. All right, so that's one set of gene changes that have to happen. We then land on the plant and we taste it again with our feet. There are sensors on our tarsi, so we taste it to make sure that we're on the right host plant. So you have to have simultaneous changes in the sensors on our tarsi. Then before we lay an egg, we taste it a third time. There are sensors on our ovipositor that's one last test to make sure you're laying your egg on the right plant. So you have to have simultaneous changes in those receptors as well. Red-spotted purples lay their eggs right at the tip of black cherry leaves, so that's a good place to look for them. First thing that happens is those eggs hatch, and the caterpillar eats the eggshell, because there's a lot of protein in there, but then it has to eat the plant. So there have to be simultaneous changes in the receptors in the mouth parts of that larva that says this is an acceptable host plant, and it's got to be able to detoxify the phytochemicals that are in that new host plant. So there have to be changes in the physiology of the young caterpillar. So that's a lot of changes that have to happen simultaneously for an insect to adopt a new host plant. They do happen. This is called a host switch, and they do happen, but not very often. It is really hard for all those things to align. Let's look at the monarch butterfly as an example. It, of course, is a specialist on plants in the milkweed lineage. In this country, that's largely Asclepias. Well, many years ago, we introduced black swallowwort as an ornamental plant, believe it or not. It's now a serious invasive, but it's in the milkweed lineage, and it smells to the monarch like milkweed. So they zero in on it, they land on it, taste like milkweed with their tarsi. They even lay eggs on it, and that's where the system breaks down. Because when those eggs hatch, they cannot eat black swallowtail, the little guys die. Now, black swallowwort was introduced way back in 1854, so it's been 170 years of opportunity for that last genetic change to happen, and it still hasn't happened. So it just illustrates how hard it is for a host switch to actually occur. Okay, a related question. You claim it takes thousands of years, if ever, for insects to adapt to new host plants, but some other entomologists disagree and point to several species of butterflies that now breed successfully on non-native plants. How do you explain that? Well, I explain it this way. There's actually two ways that insects adapt new plants. One is host switching, and that's what we just talked about, very difficult. The other one is called host range expansion. Now, most of the cases where insects are using new plants are host range expansion. They're not host switching. And what's different from host switching is that no new genetic changes have to happen for host range expansion to occur. Let's look at the black swallowtail as an example. It, of course, is a specialist on plants in the carrot family. One of the native plants that it would have used in the old days was golden Alexander. So it was able to eat plants in the carrot family. Then we introduced Queen Anne's lace, carrots, dill, parsley, fennel. They're all in the carrot family. And the black swallowtail already had all the adaptations ready to use it, so they could use it immediately. But even if you consider the few cases of host switching that occur and the more numerous cases of host range expansion that occur, when you take away native plants, there's still a 90% reduction in the insects that can use those plants. So those two types of host switches are not going to make up for the loss of native plants. Why do insects fly towards light? We've been asking this question for more than 100 years, and it turns out that one of the earliest hypotheses is the correct one. Insects have something called dorsal light response. They always make sure when they're flying that the light is coming down and hitting their backs. And that's because it never comes up from the bottom. The sun is never down there. The moon is never down in the ground. So that's what keeps them oriented in the correct way. Now, when we put a single light source out there, like a light ball, the insects do the same thing. They will always make sure the light is hitting them in their back, which means they've got to keep circling it around and around and around until finally they bang into the light. So that's why they're flying into lights, but we can use this knowledge to address a really serious environmental problem today, and that is light pollution It turns out that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect decline around the world, and we've got global insect decline. Those are all the ways that our lights are killing nocturnal insects. And of course, we've got a lot of lights out there. So a very serious problem. Let's think about the wavelengths that nocturnal insects are responding to. They're coming from the moon, and they're largely in the UV spectrum. So this gives us an opportunity to have a very simple solution to this serious environmental problem, and that is change our nocturnal lights to the warm spectrum, yellow lights. You simply take out that white bulb and put in a yellow bulb, and our nocturnal insects are no longer attracted to it. And if we were to do that everywhere, overnight we would save millions of insects. And if you use yellow LEDs, recent study came out saying LEDs are even less attractive to nocturnal insects. You'd save millions of dollars too. Okay, I live in an area with lots of Lyme disease. We all know that. Actually, I had my 6th case of Lyme disease this summer. So I know about Lyme disease. Several websites suggest keeping large lawns because they're not attractive to ticks. The sites also say I should get rid of brush piles because ticks love them. How can I contribute to local ecosystems without getting Lyme disease? Well, let's think about what, it's deer ticks, black-legged tick, that are spreading Lyme disease. Let's think about what those deer ticks need to survive in our landscapes. They don't eat native plants. They don't eat leaf litter. They don't eat brush piles. They eat blood, and they eat the blood primarily of two groups of animals. One, of course, is white-tailed deer. And the reason we have Lyme disease and a whole lot of deer ticks is because we got way too many deer out there. And they also depend on small rodents that are in our landscapes. So a good way to reduce the infectivity rates of Lyme disease is to increase the diversity of alternative hosts in our landscapes. So if a tick bites a mammal, it's probably not going to be you. And this research comes from the Carey Institute just down the street. And what they're saying is you need to put other mammals in your landscape, like skunks and chipmunks and possums and squirrels and bunnies and raccoons and groundhogs and weasels and foxes. All these guys will pick up ticks, and many of them are dead-end hosts, so the Borrelia actually dies in them, and that reduces the chances that the tick that bites you is actually going to be infected. There's a good natural experiment of this going on right now. If you go down south, there are lots of deer, and there's lots of deer ticks, but there's very little Lyme disease. Why is that? Because they've got lizards. And lizards, like anoles and skinks, are dead-end hosts. The ticks bite the lizards, and that is the end of the disease transmission. But we live up here. There aren't any lizards. How do we escape getting Lyme disease in our own yards? Well, ticks don't run after you. They climb up on vegetation. They put their little legs out. It's called questing. And when you walk by, you pick up a tick. And that's why being on a manicured lawn it's not a good place to get ticks because they're not there. But we can have manicured lawns, and we can have vegetation in our yards without getting Lyme disease, particularly in May and June. Those are the months that are highest chances of getting an infected tick. With a landscape like this, you just make a swath of lawn through your landscape, and you are going to mow it, you're going to manicure it. So it's a cue for care. It shows your neighbors that you know what the culture is, and you're not bucking it. But you have a lot of other vegetation in your yard. So you're shrinking the lawn. That's good. That's going to help you manage the watershed because you're adding more plants to the yard. You're sequestering a whole lot more carbon because lawn is the worst plant for sequestering carbon. You're going to help pollinators because you're putting blooming plants into your yard. You're going to support a food web because you're adding plants that support the caterpillars that run that food web. You're favoring native plants. And you're doing all of that while you reduce the chances of brushing up against vegetation and getting Lyme disease. Okay, plants and animals have always moved around the planet. So the arrival of new species at our shores is a natural process. So what's the big deal? If the new species are more fit than the species already here, then they deserve to replace them. I call this the they deserve it question. There's actually two questions here. What's the big deal about new species entering our ecosystems, and are new species more fit? Well, the big deal is the rate at which we're bringing new species to our ecosystems. It is true, plants and animals have moved around the planet forever, but they did it literally at a glacial pace. It was mostly continental drift that allowed things to move around. So new organisms were entering ecosystems so slowly that the ecosystems could adapt to them. The organisms in those ecosystems could adapt to them without any problem. We are now introducing plants and animals thousands of times faster than the plants and animals in our native ecosystems can adapt to them. So that's what the problem is. It's the rate at which we're bringing in new species. Are new species more fit? No. Now, we used to think they were, because it's true, particularly the non-native plants, they displace everything. They really did seem like super plants. The reason they're displacing everything is because they're here without their natural enemies. They're here without the insects that eat them. They're here without the diseases that keep them under control. They're also here without many of the big mammals that keep them under control. This is a natural area near me, White Clay Creek State Park. I took this picture in March when plants from Asia leaf out before plants from North America. So every bit of green you see there is an invasive plant from another continent. Are they super plants? No, it's just that nothing is there eating them, and we've got these guys eating all the natives. So deer, in particular, have tipped the competitive balance against our native plants. And this is important to remember when we have big invasive removal projects. If you don't keep the deer out afterwards, every native plant that pops up is going to be eaten. So deer control goes hand in hand with invasive species control, because it's the deer that actually encouraging the spread of those species. The terrible rapid rise of invasive plants on the entire continent, but let's just talk about the Northeast. It correlates perfectly with the explosion of deer populations. Is it possible to kill woody invasives without herbicide? It is. It's a lot slower, but it does work. Particularly with plants that are not stoloniferous. So don't try this on Japanese knotweed. But with things like burning bush and autumn olive and bush honeysuckle, you saw them off at the base. And this message is coming from Dennis Conover at the University of Cincinnati. Saw them off at the base, right next to the ground, and then put a sheet of black plastic or even some heavy cardboard over it. Pin it down with garden staples and leave it for a year. And what you're doing is keeping light from hitting that stump at all, and that will eventually exhaust the root system and kill it, and you haven't used any herbicide at all. You do want to go around later and pick up your black plastic, because that won't disappear in a year. So if you have a few shrubby invasives on your property and you don't want to use herbicides, this does work. What about the risk of bringing nature into our everyday spaces? Isn't interacting with nature dangerous? Well, it used to be. You know, in the old days, lions used to eat us and water buffalo stamped us, and you didn't want to fall in the river, and hyenas cleaned it up. It was a dangerous place. But it's been a long time since I saw a lion in my yard. Turns out that our ability to assess risk is really poor. There are some risks associated with nature. We do have poisonous or venomous snakes in this country, and on average, about 2 deaths a year from snake bite. West Nile virus kills about 130 of us every year, mostly old folks like me. But let's look at what's really killing us. Smoking. I heard this statistic just the other day. Smoking is still killing 400,000 people every year. Alcohol kills 75,000 of us. Melanoma, sunbathing, kills about 8,000 people a year with 76,000 new cases every year. Car crashes, of course, 44,000. Collisions with deer, 440 deaths per year from collisions with deer with cars. Dogs, our best friend, are killing 20 to 30 of us. Accidental gunshots, we're shooting each other, 499 people. Of course, overdose, the huge one, about 100,000 a year. Texting, 3,228. Cruise ships, don't go on a cruise ship. 20 of you will fall off and drown every year. Hot dogs are killing 70 of us. Autoerotic asphyxiation, whatever that is, 600 deaths a year. Lightning, 51. Vending machines, we pull vending machines over on us, kills 13 of us. Toasters, very dangerous, 370 deaths a year. Flat screen TVs are jumping off the wall and getting us. Selfies, 29 deaths a year. So selfies are 14 times more deadly than venomous snakes. Bambi is 220 times more deadly than venomous snakes, and alcohol is 577 times more deadly than West Nile virus. Can you guess how many people were killed by native plant landscaping last year? Should we kill invasive species? Do we have the ethical right to decide what plant lives or dies? That's a good question. But I think the people asking that question are actually killing plants and animals every day without even recognizing it. So for example, if you load your landscape with plants like crepe myrtle that aren't going to produce any of the bird food necessary to raise young birds, the chickadees in your nest box are going to starve to death. Because they don't have enough caterpillars to feed their young. When you have a yard that looks like this, you're deciding whether or not hundreds of species of native plants can live there and the thousands of animal species that depend on those plants. When we hire a mosquito fogger, we're not only killing a few mosquitoes, but we're also sentencing the monarchs and the pollinators and the caterpillar bird food and the natural enemies that keep things in balance. They all are being sentenced to death at the same time. So if we don't control invasives, we're gutting entire food webs. Do we have the ethical right to do that? So I'll answer that question with my own question. Why do you only focus on moths? Aren't butterflies important too? No. And I mean ecologically important. Butterflies are bad-tasting, day-flying moths. You can't see that right there. The yellow section there, those are butterflies that came out right in the middle of the phylogeny of the moths. So they literally are bad-tasting, day-flying moths. And because they don't taste very good, that's why they get to fly during the day. Most birds are not going to eat them, which means they're not adding much energy to local food webs. So that's why they're not as important as moths. Also, there's a lot more moths than butterflies. For every species of butterfly, there's 15 to 19 species of moths. So they're really important. And of course, the caterpillars of those moths are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. And that's why Dan Jansen, a very famous ecologist, calls them the meat and potatoes of terrestrial food webs. If we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. So that's why they're really important ecologically. But besides that, I think they're just cool. There are moths that look like rhinoceroses. There are moths that look like fishes, and that's not photoshopped. Like rocket ships, like stealth bombers, like jet planes, like lichens. A lot of moths look like lichens. Some of them really look like lichens. Many species look like bird poop. If you don't want to be eaten, look like bird poop. Many species are camouflaging themselves they clip off the petals of the flowers they're eating and glue them to their back so they blend right in. If you eat a conifer, there are actually 2 caterpillars in there. You want to look just like the pine needles that you're eating, or you can look just like the seed head of the helianthus that you're eating. There are many species that look just like leaves. When I saw that, I mean, that's, of course, from the web. I thought it was AI, Photoshopped, and then it flew away. It's actually a real moth in Japan. It's on my bucket list. There are species that look like seeds. There are species that look like seed pods. There are many species that look like sticks, both as caterpillars and adults. There are species that look like broken sticks. There are species that look like broken sticks at both ends. There's species that look like little wood chips. You know when a woodpecker is pounding away on a tree that's decaying, all these chips are flying out? That is a moth. Looks just like one of those chips. There's species that look like clowns. There's species that try to direct a bird's attack to a non-vital part. You know, it's a misdirection by pretending that the head is at the rear end, and that head can have 2 eyes, or it can have 4 eyes, or it can have 6 eyes. There's species with lightning logos on their sides. There are really big moths. There are really tiny moths. That's a pinhead there. There are species that are really beautiful, both as caterpillars and as adults, all kinds of beautiful adult moths. There's species that have what I call the startle effect. When their wings are closed, they look like a leaf. Then all of a sudden they spread it and scare you. There's species with 2 heads. Not really. I gave this talk once, and a woman came up to me afterward and said, "How can they have 2 heads?" That's a mating pair. They don't really have 2 heads. There's species that really look like snakes. This is a sphinx moth, great snake mimic. Species that look like bumblebees, species that look like Polistes wasps. That's the lilac borer from my backyard. There's species that look like yellow jackets. There's species that look like spiders. Species that look just like fireflies. Ones that look like jewels and ones that look like that. So I just think they're really cool. Okay, this is a more and more common question I get, and it has a very unpopular answer. So remember, I'm just the messenger here. Do honeybees compete with native bees? Well, let's look at what honeybees really do. They are extreme generalists. A single hive can have up to 30,000 individuals, and each one of those can forage up to 2 miles from the hive. So a single hive can potentially compete with native bees over 8,000 acres. Now, beekeepers supplement their hives with sugar. So even when there's not a lot of forage in the landscape, and there's not a lot of blooming plants, they keep the number of the honeybees up. As of April 2022, there were 2.92 million hives in the U.S., which means honeybees have saturated continental U.S. 11.5 times. Now, if we assume that native bee populations are as high as the environment can support, they're near their carrying capacity, and then you introduce a single hive of 30,000 new bees, there's no way it can move into that area without competing with those bees by degrading the resources that are available. And there are some very good studies that have recently come out. This one just came out in 2025. It was done on an island where they had a lot of native bees, but no honeybees. Then they introduced honeybees, and they measured what happened to nectar availability, to the native bee populations, and pollen availability. And nectar availability decreased by 60%, pollen availability decreased by 30%, and the native bee populations crashed by 80%. So yes, honeybees compete with native bees. Privet flowers. Privet flowers are good sources of honey. They really mean nectar and pollen for honeybees. So if we remove privet in our fight against invasive plants, isn't that going to hurt our honeybees? Well, you know, there's 9 species of invasive privet in this country. I didn't know that, but there are, and they cover a lot of area. That's me right down there. So privet can get big. I don't know if that's a single bush or 2 or 3 bushes, but it's the only thing growing in that space. Now privet, and by the way, privet covers 1 million acres in Alabama alone. So it's a serious invasive species, particularly down south. It does bloom for about a week. And during that week, it's supplying a lot of honey or a lot of nectar and pollen for both native bees and honeybees. But then the rest of the 51 weeks of the year, it looks like this. It's simply a plant that's occupying space that's contributing nothing. So if you really want to help your bees, you want to have blooming plants during the entire season, not just 1 week of the year. Our oaks are dying right and left. It's true. We've introduced bacterial leaf scorch and oak wilt and sudden oak death syndrome. And these are really hitting the susceptible members of our oak populations very hard. The good news is that all of the populations have resistant individuals in it. So we have to wait for the susceptible ones to be weeded out. The resistant ones will take over, and that'll be a good day. But in the meantime, many of our oaks are dying. This is a red oak on my property that has died from bacterial leaf scorch. And the question is, should we remove the wood after it's dead, or is that going to still pass on the disease organisms? No, dead wood doesn't pass on the disease. It's when the tree is dying, when it's living, that the bacteria are in the xylem and phloem, and the insects picked it up and move it to another plant. But once it's dead and on the ground, it's not spreading disease at all. So if you have the chance to keep some, we call it coarse woody debris, on the ground, it's a wonderful resource for lots of creatures. There are literally millions of little collembolans of several different species that live in those logs. There are the predators that eat those collembolans. There are millipedes that eat the fungus that's decaying the logs. There are a number of species of beetles that breed in those logs, things like click beetles, fire-colored beetles. This in itself is a mystery. You can pull up the bark of a down log, and you will find fire-colored beetle larvae. They're very common, but you never see the adults. Where are the adults? I don't know. Many species of scarab beetles breed in dead wood. We've got cerambycid longhorn beetles and their flathead borer larvae. We've got lecanid stag beetles in logs. We've got basalid best beetles. We've got crested metallic wood-boring beetles. So they're really a rich place for beetles to breed. There are several species of butterflies that overwinter in the cracks and crevices of down logs, like mourning cloaks, like commas, like question marks. And then, of course, we've got those carpenter bees The reason the carpenter bees are in the soffits of our house and the railings of our porches is because we've taken away the place that they normally breed. If you can leave wood on your property, that's where they will breed. And we've got carpenter ants. Why do we want carpenter ants? By the way, carpenter ants do not eat your house. They don't eat wood. They simply hollow it out and live in it. Well, we want carpenter ants because that is what the major woodpeckers feed their young on. You won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have carpenter ants. And you won't have carpenter ants unless you have that coarse woody debris to produce them. Is rearing monarchs good or bad? It depends on what your intentions are. There are more and more people, of course everybody wants to save the monarch. Well, there's two reasons that people are generally rearing monarchs. For fun and educational purposes, that's a major reason, but also for conservation. I have no problems at all with rearing monarchs and giant silk moths and swallowtails, lots of things that people rear for educational purposes. It's a wonderful way to introduce kids and their parents to the wonderful life of insects. They can learn about complete metamorphosis, the egg, the larva, the pupa, the adult. They can learn about host plant specialization. There's probably not a third grader out there that can't tell you that monarchs need milkweeds. That's host plant specialization. But when you rear for conservation, it's much harder to do it without downsides. So it's very hard to do it without crowding them. And when you crowd them, that's a recipe for disease transmission. You're also rearing them indoors. Remember, you're rearing them to boost the populations outdoors, but you've removed the filter of natural selection. So then you're releasing organisms that have not been filtered by natural selection. Also, people have wonderful intentions. They want to help the monarch, but they don't really know how to do it. I have seen so many people rearing mass numbers of monarchs, and they're doing a terrible job. They don't change the leaves enough. It's full of frass in the bottom of the container. The leaves are all drying up. So the monarchs that come out are smaller than they ought to be. And there's actually some data from Mexico where they look at monarchs that have been tagged. The ones that have been tagged that were reared indoors, there's 40% fewer. Survivorship is 40% lower than the ones that are tagged that are reared outside. So there do seem to be some costs from rearing them indoors. The best way to support monarchs is to create a big resource patch of what they need, and that is milkweeds. Then they're not removed from natural selection, they get to do their thing, and they'll never run out of food. Related question, the monarchs on my milkweed keep disappearing. Just when they get big, they disappear. And I get this question for black swallowtails and others. I assume the birds are eating them, but I thought monarch caterpillars tasted bad, so I'm confused. What is stealing my monarchs? Nothing. It turns out that both moths, but butterflies in addition, want to get as far away from their host plant as they can before they make their chrysalis, because the natural enemies find the chrysalis and the butterfly by looking for the host plant. So if you're a monarch, you want to get away from the milkweed. I've never found a chrysalis on milkweed. This is in my yard. It's on grass stem. Here's a pipevine swallowtail chrysalis, also on grass. I found a pipevine swallowtail chrysalis on the lower edge of a picture frame in my living room. And it crawled right in through the sliding glass door and up the wall. It was a predator-free space. We left the sliding glass door open. So the bottom line is that nothing's taking your monarchs or your other butterflies. They're simply forming their chrysalis someplace where you are not looking. Could you provide your thoughts on the use of southern, more heat-tolerant species within our northern parts of the U.S.? Yes, I can. That's called assisted migration. It's controversial, but I'm not a fan, and this is the reason I'm not a fan. There are actually two reasons. That is the jet stream. It's moving from west to east across North America, directing major weather systems, particularly in the wintertime. And generally speaking, it used to behave pretty well. It wobbled a little bit, but above it was generally colder, and below it was generally warmer. This is what the jet stream's doing today with climate change. It's gone crazy, again, particularly in the wintertime. And when it goes way far north, it's unusually warm up here, and when it goes way far south, it's unusually cold. Remember last winter, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, had 9 inches of snow, and it got down to 9 degrees. Colder than it's ever been recorded down there, right over there. That's called the polar vortex. They're happening every single winter now. So if we start moving our plants from the south up north, polar vortices are going to get them. But even if that didn't happen, I'm not a fan for this reason. You're moving plants away from the community of plants and animals that they co-evolved with. One of the major functions of plants is to support the local food web. And if you move them away from particularly the insects that are adapted to eating those plants, they won't contribute very much, and they'll function very much like a plant from Asia. So I think that what we need to do is just hope that the genetic variability in our native plant communities is enough that they can withstand the crazy climate swings that we're throwing at them. What do you think of no mow May? Not mow much. It's a good idea, but ecologically it makes no sense. This is what happens when you don't mow your lawn. It gets to be tall, cool season European grasses. This is a house down the street from us that went through foreclosure and nobody mowed the lawn. That still is not a good resource for pollinators. If you have a terrible lawn that's full of dead nettle and clover and dandelions, it will have some blooming plants in it in the month of May. But then in June you mow it and you pull the rug out from underneath all those pollinators. Pollinators need resources. They need flowering plants all season long. So around here, they need them from the end of April right through into, mid-October anyway. So what we need is no-mow areas, places that are never mowed. We call them pollinator gardens, and the bigger, the better. This one's certainly servicing an awful lot of pollinators. But if you don't have that much space, you can be creative about it. The point is to get blooming plants into your yard that are never mowed, not just in May. I often find the expense of purchasing native plants is out of my budget. Do you have any suggestions? Well, I'll pass on one of Rick Dark's suggestions, and that is what he calls addition by subtraction. You don't actually have to plant anything. You just have to remove the plants you don't want, and nature will plant the rest. So this is what a section of our yard looked like a few years ago. That's an oak tree that I did plant as an acorn. These are Ilex petriculata that I did plant, but I didn't plant anything else. The andropogon and the native asters and the milkweeds and the goldenrods all came in on their own. All we have to do is keep the invasive plants out. Who's bringing in all these plants? Well, the animal life around us, the red squirrels, the gray squirrels, the chipmunks, the blue jays. Of course, they're carrying acorns and beech trees, beech seeds, mile and a half from the parent tree. There are little white structures called eliosomes on our spring ephemeral seeds, and they're designed to get ants to move them around. Ants love these eliosomes. That's a bloodroot seed. So the ant will pick up the bloodroot seed and take it to the nest. They all eat the eliosome. They can't eat the seeds, so they throw it in the garbage dump of the ant nest, which is 1 inch below the surface of the soil. It's a perfect place for that seed to germinate. And they can carry that seed, several yards from the parent plant. So what you have to do is simply monitor and remove the ones you don't want, like burning bush. They make it easy for you, turn nice and red in the fall. Get your little hand whacker, whack. What is that? Popcorn tree down south. All these woody invasives are easy to get rid of when they're small. But you have to be vigilant when they're tough. When they're big, they're much harder to get rid of. Do you have a succinct statement to submit to my HOA who recently cited me for growing weeds? I have lots of statements. None of them are succinct, but try this. We humans face life-threatening crises from climate change and biodiversity loss. Reducing the area of lawn and using more productive native plants in our landscapes addresses both of these crises. This can be done tastefully without the use of chemicals and without reducing property values. It is the future of landscaping. And if that works, let me know. More HOA questions. My HOA believes native plants reduce property values. How can I convince them otherwise? By making a native plant landscape that doesn't reduce property values. The assumption there is that you can't use native plants formally. They always have to be wild and messy. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design, 100% native plant. That was taken by a drone 400 feet up. And you don't get more formal than that. So just remember, tell your HOA that formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. This is a 100% non-native landscape. That's a Norway maple there, Asian azaleas, English ivy, pachysandra on the ground, and then cool season European grasses. It's a mess, and the HOA might be upset about this. So it's not the origin of the plant that they're worried about. It's really how you maintain that area. This is Pam Carlson's property that I talk about all the time. She lives in the middle of Chicago, 100% native plant landscape except for the little pathway of grass there. And no HOA is going to throw Pam out. Remember, HOAs don't know native plants from non-native plants. They do know good maintenance from non-maintenance. I have a small property. Should I plant several individuals of a few species, or should I try to squeeze as much diversity onto the property as possible, but only have one or two individuals of each species? That's a good question, because we all know diversity is good, but it depends on what it is you're trying to manage for. Let's say you want to help the monarch. One or two rabbits of milkweed is not enough. I got an email from a lady a few years ago. She said, I planted a milkweed, but worms got on them, so I squished them. Yes. One or two rabbits, the monarch will come and say, here's milkweed, it'll lay an egg in it, and then it's going to look for another plant. Oh, there's one, the same one, lay another egg. If you get 2 or 3 eggs on it, they will strip it, and then the homeowner's upset, oh, they killed my milkweed. They didn't actually, it'll come up from the roots again. But you need a real milkweed patch if you want to help milkweeds, and that's a wonderful way to do it. If you want to help pollinators, massing what they're getting pollen and nectar from really helps the pollinators, because they can do it very efficiently. They can go from flower to flower without having to spend a lot of energy, rather than flying a quarter mile in between each flower. But if you have a small property, you can't have everything on there. So this is a good time to meet your neighbors. Here's a brand new neighborhood where they could divvy up what's happening. And there is enough space in that entire neighborhood to have the oaks, to have the pollinator gardens, to have the eastern meadow, to have all kinds of diversity out there. But nobody's going to squeeze it all onto one yard. How can I convince my neighbor to stop mosquito fogging? A woman came up to me a while ago and said this was an issue for her. Her neighbor was fogging. It was killing everything on her property. So she went up to the neighbors and she said, what are you afraid of? And it turned out they're afraid that their kids are going to get a mosquito-borne disease and die. So, okay, let's look at the statistics. Between 1999 and 2007, there were 3 kids in the U.S. who died from mosquito-borne diseases. That's 0.37 deaths per year, in comparison to 8,760 kids that died in car crashes at that time, which we don't worry about. There's 73.2 million kids under the age of 16. If you do the math, the chances of your child dying from mosquito-borne disease in any one year is 1 out of 197 million, which is, 3 times less likely than winning the lottery. So it's real, it exists, but it's pretty minuscule. The next thing you can do is explain what the costs of fogging are. And this is where we can really use some education, because most people, they hear from the fogging company, this is an organic, natural product that only kills mosquitoes. And if that were true, I would hire them too. Organic and natural, it's a pyrethroid compound. That's what chrysanthemums use to kill the insects that get on them. So organic, I guess, but cyanide is organic. Ricin is organic. So being organic and natural does not make it safe. Only kills mosquitoes. That's not even close to true. It kills everything, folks. And that's not just anecdotal. We've done an experiment this summer with undergrads. We actually bought a backpack sprayer so we can fog just the way the people do. Even 30 days after an area was fogged, and I'm just talking about the surfaces, so not the insects themselves. Even 30 days later, it kills 26 different species of insects and arachnids from 9 different orders. In other words, it killed everything we tested. So this is deadly stuff that we're putting on our fence posts, on our houses, and then we touch it later on. It's still really deadly stuff. So the answer is that mosquito fogging does kill everything, and most people don't realize that. There's a sign out there that I think is pretty convincing. You can give them one of these. No mosquitoes means no fireflies, no ladybugs, no pollinators, no butterflies, no hummingbirds, and so on. Is that really what you want? And then finally, give them an alternative. It's not that you have to live with mosquitoes, but you control them in the larval stage. And mosquito dunks that I've talked about several times. Or you put a fan on your picnic table. You're having your cocktail, turn the fan on, the mosquitoes don't fly into the directed breeze. There are ways to live with mosquitoes. And you know what? Mosquito fogging didn't take off in this country until there was a risk of Zika virus. Never actually got here. But as soon as that was in the news, everybody started fogging for mosquitoes. How did we exist before then? Maybe we can go back to then and figure out what that was. Why do you want us to keep leaves on our property? 4 major reasons. They're protecting the moisture that's in the soil. Everything that lives in the soil requires high moisture levels, so it forms a blanket protecting that moisture, prevents soil erosion. It's returning the nutrients that your tree used this year back into the soil so your tree can use it again. And then finally, leaves provide a lot of habitat. Again, the soil harbors more species than are found above ground, and all of them need high humidity. In a single square meter of leaf litter, there's 250,000 mites, 100,000 springtails, 90,000 proturans, which are primitive insects, 1 million nematodes. These guys are eating the leaves, returning the nutrients to the soil, so the mycorrhizae in your soil can transfer them to your tree roots. And the mycorrhizae need high moisture levels as well. There are also some very pretty butterflies that depend on our leaves, things like the banded hairstreak. The caterpillar eats dead leaves like that. There are 70 species of what we call litter moths, like the ambiguous litter moth, the American idea, the dark-spotted palthus, and 67 other species where the caterpillars develop on dead leaves. And then you have all the predators that are eating all of those caterpillars. It's a very complex community, and that includes fireflies. That's what an adult firefly lightning bug looks like. It's not a fly or a bug, it's a beetle. And that's what the caterpillar or the larva looks like, kind of like a little dinosaur. But it's a predator in leaf litter. If you rake away your leaf litter, you lose your fireflies. And then, of course, it's a wonderful resource for the birds, not just in the summertime, but all winter long as well. What should I do with those leaves? My son bought a house a couple years ago, and in the first fall, he called me up and he said, "Dad, I've got too many leaves. What should I do with them?" I said, "Put them in your flower beds." He said, "I don't have enough flower beds." I said, "Exactly." That's how you shrink the lawn, folks. You make bigger flower beds around your trees. Now, this is a neighbor down the street. I would never use his landscape as a model, but he does seem to get it. I'm going to put my leaves in the flower beds. And then the next question is, aren't those leaves going to kill the plants in my flower beds? Who was raking the leaves before we got here? And there were plants in North America. I read about it. Plants are really good at getting through leaf litter. Now, I'm not talking about 5 feet thick, but a normal layer of leaf litter, they come right up through it. This is wood poppies coming through the oak leaf litter that I don't rake, and there they are a few weeks later. Here are tiny little delicate violets coming through. No problem getting through those leaves. So our plants are much better at getting through normal layers of leaf litter. If you rake all your flower beds out every year, you're losing a really valuable resource. Can I mulch my leaves? Well, you can, but then you're grinding up all the things I just described in your leaf litter. So it makes them a little bit more attractive, I guess, but you're losing some of the value. And they also don't live as long. The leaves don't last as long. If they disappear at the end of July, then you've got a month of bare soil, and that's a no-no. Then you have to go out and you buy mulch. So just use the leaf litter that's there. There are living things in that leaf litter. There is a cocoon of a beautiful moth called the dot line white in there. Can you see it? Right there. There it is a little closer. And that's the beautiful moth that comes out of there. You would have ground that up. You would have ground up the Luna moth cocoon and all the other wonderful things that are in your leaf litter if you mulch it. I know caterpillars are important for birds. How can I increase caterpillar productivity on my property? Now, this is basically what I talk about in all my talks, so we'll just zoom through this. You want to use the plants that make the most caterpillars. We call them keystone plants, and you can find the best keystone plants in your county by going into Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most important woody and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. So now we know what plants are going to support the most caterpillars. But what we need to talk about is how we landscape underneath those plants, particularly the trees, so that the caterpillars can complete their life cycle. When a caterpillar eats the leaves of a tree, it reaches its full length, and then it drops from the tree. Most of them, about 94%, drop from the tree. They wiggle their way beneath the soil surface and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree, and that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. when we mow and compact the area under the tree so it's rock hard, so that those caterpillars that are developing in those oaks right there are going to die. That makes those oaks an ecological trap, and we don't want that to happen. So what we want to do is create what Heather Holm calls soft landings under our trees, layered landscapes. They're essentially no-go zones. They're going to be places where we're not mowing and we're not walking, because that keeps the landscape, keeps the soil from becoming compacted, and it keeps our big heavy feet off of there too. So this is what most people do. You've got lawn that goes right up to the tree. As a matter of fact, 81% of the ground under our trees is either lawn or pavement, and caterpillars do very poorly there. Here's some real data. This is from my master's student, Emma Jonas. When you have lawn under your tree, the caterpillars pupate right up in the thatch of the lawn, about 1 centimeter under the ground, which means when you walk or you mow under there, you are squishing them. 1 footfall is enough to squish 44% of the pupae that are there, and 1 pass with a mower squishes 46%. And of course, we don't do it once, we do it all season long, so it's very hard on those overwintering caterpillars. What we need to do is create these very, very pretty places. Again, this is how you reduce the lawn. You put big beds under your tree. You can use native ground covers like wild ginger. You can use, this is Virginia creeper is a great ground cover, May apples, foam flower, ferns. You can make a number of really beautiful landscapes under there. It's called green mulch. If you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants. This is, it's not maintenance free, but they're beautiful landscapes and they're full of life. Also add some hardscape, rocks. A lot of caterpillars would get under rocks to pupate, very safe place for them to pupate. And many species actually tunnel into logs. So add some again, that coarse woody debris to your gardens. The caterpillars will tunnel right into that, like the leopard moth, the pearly wood nymph. Here's its caterpillar, and there it is tunneling into my back porch. They're just, you didn't think a caterpillar could do that, but they can eat the wood, and then they push out the sawdust on the other end, and they pupate inside that wood. So you have to supply that. And another thing we haven't thought about very much is supplying the food that our moths need at night. This is called a wine rope. You get 1 bottle of cheap red wine and 1 box of dark brown sugar, mix it together, and then soak a rope, and you put it out at night, and that is what comes. What you're doing is supplying the energy for these moths to live longer and lay more eggs, because most of our yards don't have enough blooming plants. We can add night blooming species, though, things like buttonbush and evening primrose and perennial sunflowers and goldenrods and common milkweed, white snakeroot, whole big long list of plants that bloom at night, and all of them are visited by moths. So that increases the population of the things that are actually those meat and potatoes of terrestrial food webs. Do cultivars of native plants have the same ecological value as their parent species? It used to be the most common question I got, and the question is, it depends on what the cultivar trait is. This plant is Phlox paniculata genna. It was found in the Tennessee mountains, and it turns out it has, and then it was brought in, they put a name on it, but it's a natural variant. It has twice the flowers as the straight species. And guess what? It supports twice the flowers, twice the pollinators as the straight species. So to say all cultivars are bad or all cultivars are good is not the way it is. It depends. We did a study looking at 6 different traits of woody plants that are commonly used as cultivars. So enhancing fall coloration, adding leaf variegation, taking a tall plant, making it short, adding disease resistance, turning green leaves into red or purple leaves. 3-year common garden experiment at Mount Cuba Center, and it turned out that the red leaf cultivars, taking green leaves and making them red or purple, adds anthocyanins to the leaves, and that is the only trait that consistently reduced insect use. So that was good news. Now, when we make cultivars out of flowers, the news isn't quite as good. If you make a double flower, for example, this is bloodroot. What you're doing is taking the reproductive parts of the flower, the anthers and the stigma, and turning them into petals, and it's very beautiful, but it offers nothing for the bees. As a matter of fact, it's a distraction because they go to it thinking there's something there, and there isn't. So you should avoid double flower cultivars. That's true for most of our hydrangeas as well. There's a relationship between specialist bees, the ones that can only reproduce on the pollen and nectar of particular species of flowers, and those flowers. It's a very specialized relationship. So if you change the flower that the specialist bee has specialized on, you're going to mess up that relationship. And about a third of our native bees, got almost 4,000 species of native bees, a third of them are specialized. So changing their flowers is not a good idea. Mount Cuba Center has been doing trial gardens with mostly perennial flowers, comparing the cultivars with their straight species, and they put the results of those trials up on their website. So the very latest and best research comparing how cultivars do with straight species is up there on that Mount Cuba Center website. Why should I join Homegrown National Park? The Homegrown National Park movement. Now, I have an entire talk on why you should do this, but just very briefly, it's not an organization, it is a movement. We are trying to get the message that everybody in the world, but we'll start with this country and Canada, is responsible for the future of conservation because, again, everybody requires it. You go to our website, you register your property on the biodiversity map, the amount of area you're being a good steward of, and then your little piece of your county pops up, is labeled with a firefly. You get to see how many other people in your county have joined this movement, and the object is to get the entire country to light up with fireflies. Our mission is to really move this message that we are all responsible for conservation to the greater masses, and the organization is designed to get the information necessary for you to make this cultural change, make it easily available. Does urban restoration work? Or are you encouraging ecological traps that will lure animals to their death? It's a really important question, and we need a lot more research on it. But so far, the early data, it's very encouraging. Emily Geist of Omaha, Nebraska, and former student Brian Cutting years ago, they both did different studies comparing monarch survivorship in suburban gardens with monarch survivorship in, quote, the wild. It was much higher in suburban gardens. So that was very encouraging. Artificial nest boxes. Look how they saved the bluebird. In the late 60s and early 70s, the bluebird was in serious decline. We didn't have the snags that they needed. They're cavity nesters. We'd introduced the starling and the house sparrow that were competing with them. And they were declining all over the place. And then we realized, hey, they use bluebird boxes. We've got bluebird trails everywhere now. And it's one of the most common birds in our human-dominated landscapes. Benedict Schmidt of Switzerland noticed that 10 species of amphibians were declining in an urban area, Argois, Switzerland. So he dug ponds all over the city. And then he measured the response of these 10 species. 9 of them increased rapidly. The 10th one did not because the ponds he dug were too small for that particular species. But right in the middle of the city with all the lights and all the roads, the population still increased. Very encouraging. But we do need a lot more research. Okay, finally, the last question. What gives you hope? How do you not become discouraged at hand? Well, I don't listen to the news after dinner anymore. But there really are several reasons I am hopeful, and one of them is that these crises, particularly the biodiversity crisis, is now part of the national discussion. The UN has met at least 3 times to talk about this, to pass resolutions. What can we do? The last time they met was in Paris in May. The US was the only country not to attend those meetings, but it's part of the global discussion, and that's good. But what's really getting me excited is that the public is starting to recognize that as individuals, we are not powerless when it comes to conservation. We really can reduce the 44 million acres of lawn that we have out there. We can use those keystone plants, the ones that are supporting the most caterpillars. We can change our light bulbs. It's very easy. We can fire Mosquito Joe. We can put beds under our trees. We can add pollinator gardens to our yard. We can put a little fence around them to formalize them so our neighbor doesn't get upset. We can remove our invasive plants. municipalities are incentivizing. They're starting to monetize this. The Minnesota's been doing it for a while. There's a cost-sharing program where they're paying homeowners to reduce or eliminate their lawn and replace them with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants, very popular. Pennsylvania has a similar program. Virginia's thinking about starting one. States are starting to ban the sale of invasive plants. Delaware has banned the sale of all the invasive plants, but other states are doing it piecemeal, so that's good. HOAs really are starting to recognize that native landscaping is not going to reduce property values if we do it tastefully. We can't leave this without talking about agriculture, because almost half the country is in some form of agriculture, and this has been what has destroyed monarch populations and bee populations across the country. When we get Roundup Ready corn and soybeans, we decide we would spray right up to the road and get rid of all the weeds, and that was milkweed and asters and goldenrod and Joe Pye and all the other, and then replace it with grass that then had to be mowed. So it was a terrible loss of biodiversity right through the heartland. But we're realizing we can return it. There are growers that are putting the prairie plants back along road verges. Prairie strips, wonderful invention. This comes out of Iowa State. You put the pollinator strips right through the corn and right through the soybeans, perpendicular to the flow of water off the farmland, so it captures 90% of the topsoil and 90-some% of the nutrients that are not getting into our waterways anymore. And it's supported by CRP funding, or it was last week. What's really encouraging me, though, is the speed at which these changes are happening. When I started this, I wasn't sure anything was going to happen, but it's not only happening, it's happening really quickly. Aldo Leopold once said that one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in the world of wounds. Well, he said that in the 40s. It's no longer true. You're no longer alone. Everywhere, people are starting to heal the wounds on their little piece of the earth, and you can too. Robert Swan recently said the greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it. It's not going to be someone else, folks. It's going to be you folks. I'll help, but it's going to be you. And that's because you are nature's best hope. Thank you very much. There are the websites I mentioned.